So fellas, the welterweight division might be the best it's ever been as of right now, and we'd have had multiple different eras of the welterweight division up until the modern era. So I thought I'd create an all-time welterweight tournament where we put together a tournament mixed with different welterweight legends from multiple different eras, everybody in their prime, against each other to kind of see what matchups we get and who comes out on top. I've also color coordinated them as well for each era, so it was kind of, easier to see which era they come from. And we'll just go straight in there with the first fight, which is going to be Jack Della Maddalena versus Tyron Woodley, former champion versus current champion. I'm picking Jack to piece up Tyron Woodley. I think Jack wins this pretty comfortably. Tyron Woodley was a good champion, and I do think he was actually quite underrated by fans, but it's no surprise that the second he started increasing the competition, he fell through. And I know he was past his prime at this point, but the performance against Kamaru Usman where he got destroyed, broke his rib against Colby Covington after getting dominated, then went on that big losing skid in the UFC. Even in his prime, I think Jack Della Maddalena wins this one pretty comfortably against prime Tyron Woodley, pieces him up on the feet, keeps the fight standing. I'm picking Jack Della Maddalena to beat Tyron Woodley, probably by decision, but I'm going to go JDM, the current champion, to beat the champion of a couple of years back. JDM beats Tyron Woodley, knocks him off in the first round, which is quite unfortunate for Woodley because any other fighter from any different era, Woodley probably has a good chance of beating, but I'm picking Jack, the current champion, to beat Woodley. Then we've got Michael Morales versus Darren Till. I'm going to have to sprinkle a bit of recency bias. I say that, but they both competed last week, both won last week as well. Listen, Darren Till, I know this is be a very competitive striking matchup, but I'm going to go with Morales because what has Darren Till really done in the welterweight division? I'm going to be honest now, Michael Morales has accomplished more than Darren Till in the welterweight division, purely in this division. Darren Till's best win was a split decision, or I think it was a split decision, controversial win over Stephen Wonderboy Thompson and an old losing streak, Donald Cerrone. I know it was a losing streak at the time, but an older version of Donald Cerrone. Michael Morales just had that really good performance against Gilbert Burns. There's no way Darren Till finishes Burns in the first round. Slept in Neil Magny, undefeated 17-0 on a massive winning streak in the UFC. Darren Till, big name, and definitely makes this a competitive fight. We saw him when he moved to the middleweight division have a competitive fight with Robert Whittaker and, managed to beat Kelvin Gastelum. But I do think Morales is the better striker out of the two of them. It would be competitive because Darren Till, like I said, great Muay Thai striker, but I'm going to go with Morales. Darren Till hasn't really done anything in the welterweight division apart from get a really close decision win over Stephen Wonderboy Thompson. So I'm going to go Michael Morales. It is a very close fight. I wouldn't be surprised if Till was to win, but I'm going to lean towards Morales winning this one. Then we've got Jorge Masvidal versus BJ Penn. Now, Joe Rogan would tell you that BJ Penn would lose to Jorge Masvidal. I don't know what it was that made Jorge Masvidal so high on Joe Rogan, or maybe the other way around. I'm going to go BJ Penn to win this one. Goes without saying, one of the greatest of all time because of the amount of divisions he competed in as well. Had a great legacy at both lightweight and in the welterweight division, but yeah, BJ Penn, even though the competition had increased by the time Masvidal was around, BJ Penn's a better fighter everywhere. Better boxer, better BJJ, better wrestler. I'm pretty convinced that he would beat Masvidal everywhere the fight goes. Masvidal was a one-year pawn. He had a really good 2019 and then kind of fell off. I'm picking BJ Penn to destroy Jorge Masvidal. Probably gets a submission within the first two. Then we've got Leon Edwards versus Thiago Alves. I think Leon Edwards pieces up Thiago Alves. Alves was pretty dangerous in his prime, but Leon Edwards, still one of the more technical fighters. Even as of today, still one of the most technical fighters on the roster. That's kind of been part of the reasons why he's not really been able to pick up a win, because he can't deal with any pressure against the likes of Belal Muhammad and Sean Brady. But I think he pieces up Thiago Alves, gets the job done. Probably decision win for Leon Edwards. I don't think I can ever pick Leon to finish anybody at this point. Leon Edwards by decision. We then have Nick Diaz versus Michael Chiesa. I may or may not have given this matchup for Nick Diaz so we can get a free win, but I'm going to go with Nick Diaz to beat Michael Chiesa. Yeah, the UFC robbed Nick Diaz of his prime, making him get suspended for, what was it, 5 years for weed. Horrible decision. I don't think the UFC did it. It might have been the Athletic Commission, but either way, Nick Diaz's prime was an absolute brawler. I think he was definitely the better Diaz brother in terms of skill out of him and Nate Diaz. Nate might have been the bigger star, but Diaz was the better fighter. The BJJ is not going to be a problem for Michael Chiesa. If anything, it's going to be Nick Diaz submitting Michael Chiesa, because Chiesa, even though he's a good submission artist, he also leaves himself able to get submitted a lot as well. He's got a shit ton of submission losses on his record, and on the feet it's night and day. Nick Diaz, by however he wants, destroys Michael Chiesa. Rafael dos Anjos versus Carlos Newton. Carlos Newton was the second ever welterweight champion. Anyway, yeah, fuck off Nick Diaz. Yeah, I'm going to go Rafael dos Anjos to win this one. This would just be an example of the modern era of the world. Well, I say modern era. Dos Anjos is, his era was a long time ago. But in comparison to Carlos Newton, this would be an example of how the sport has progressed. Rafael dos Anjos is a better fighter everywhere from Carlos Newton. Carlos Newton, even though he might be a legend in his own right, he was more of a physical merchant rather than an actual skill fighter. So dos Anjos beats Newton however he wants. Carlos Prates versus Donald Cerrone, another really competitive fight, because Donald Cerrone in his day was an amazing kickboxer. Some of the best combinations. And maybe I'm, throwing a bit of recency bias on this, but I'm going to go with Carlos Prates to beat Donald Cerrone. I know how good of a kickboxer Donald Cerrone was back in the day, but there's nothing to really tell us that Carlos Prates loses to Donald Cerrone. You know, he's been slightly outclassed by Ian Gary, where he nearly finished that fight, and apart from that, he's looked pretty much flawless in the UFC, and he's been able to just, finish everybody on the feet. Amazing striking ability, some of the best Muay Thai in the welterweight division, still one of the best strikers in the welterweight division, definitely top 5. I'd say he's more dangerous than Donald Cerrone too. Donald Cerrone might have the better combinations. I can see Cerrone winning around, but I think Carlos Prates eventually would get the win over Donald Cerrone, whether it be by finish, whether it be by decision. I'm going to go with the current top 10 welterweight Carlos Prates. I don't even think he's top 10. Top 15 welterweight Carlos Prates to beat Donald Cerrone. And then we've got Colby Covington versus Josh Koscheck. I heard people saying this has been a competitive fight. Colby Covington in his prime a couple of years ago, like 5 to 6 years ago, absolutely mauls Koscheck. Koscheck is another one of these fighters that fairly skilled, more of a physical merchant. Colby Covington completely out-wrestles and ragdolls Josh Koscheck got 25 minutes. I think this will be a Colby Covington mauling against Koscheck. Another example of how the sport of MMA can evolve. I'm picking Colby Covington to beat Koscheck. Koscheck might have had a big right hand and a good double leg takedown. Ain't working against Covington. Covington mauls him. I'm picking Colby to win this one. Johnny Hendricks versus Neo Magny. I mean, this just looks like, you put 2 frogs in a blender. It's a bit of a mauling. Yeah, Johnny Hendricks, prime, full of steroids, on the roids, on the juice. He destroys Neo Magny. He probably gets a KO in the first round. Neo Magny probably going to go down as one of the greatest gatekeepers in UFC history. Johnny Hendricks nearly beat GSP in his prime. He finishes Neo Magny in the first round by a brutal KO, which is kind of sad for Neo Magny. I feel like this dude, every single match I put him in, or just any match that anybody puts Neo Magny in, it's always like he's the victim in every fight, and he's also a victim in this fight too, because Johnny Hendricks would finish Neo Magny by KO early on. Nate Diaz versus Kenny Florian. Nate Diaz kills him. Nate Diaz beats him everywhere the fight goes. In the striking department, Nate Diaz is piecing up Kenny. In the grappling department, could be quite competitive, but I see Nate Diaz holding his own. I think Nate Diaz would probably win by exhaustion, gets a 4th or 5th round TKO. If it's a 3-rounder, gets a decision win. I'm going to go with Nate Diaz to beat Florian by some sort of TKO within the fight. Then we've got Bilal Muhammad versus John Fitch. I hear a lot of people nowadays talking about Bilal Muhammad versus Sean Strickland being a boring fight. Bilal Muhammad versus John Fitch might actually go down, if this was to ever happen, as one of the most boring fights in UFC history. Both of these guys have a similar style of kind of this boring, grappling, control-heavy style, but I'm picking Bilal Muhammad to win. He's the better striker. He's the better grappler. He's from today's generation. John Fitch is like 10, 15 years ago, so I'm picking Bilal Muhammad definitely to beat John Fitch. Could even get a stoppage, which isn't something we often see from Bilal Muhammad, but both these against each other in their primes, if it wasn't just pure domination from Bilal Muhammad, this might actually go down as one of the worst fights that the UFC could have ever put on. But I'm picking Bilal to win this one, maybe even by a late stoppage, if not, obviously by decision. We've then got Stephen Wonderboy Thompson versus Matt Hughes. Matt Hughes is another example of a guy that was a bit of a physicality merchant. He was one of the strongest fighters in the UFC. His pound-for-pound strength in the welterweight division was insane. If you go and watch or listen to a bunch of guys that fought Matt Hughes, they'll tell you how strong this guy was and how physical he was. But Stephen Wonderboy Thompson pieces him up. Stephen Wonderboy Thompson keeps the fight standing against Matt Hughes. It's definitely easy. I know it's easier said than done, but we're talking about a guy who's in the GSP era against the current modern welterweight. Stephen Wonderboy Thompson keeps the fight standing and absolutely picks apart Matt Hughes until he gets a late finish in the 4th or the 5th round. Also, the gas tank of Matt Hughes wasn't amazing as well, so I'm picking Stephen Wonderboy Thompson to beat Matt Hughes. Pieces him up, gets a decision win, if not, gets a late TKO. Against Matt Hughes, we've then got Matt Serra versus Robbie Lawler. This would be a brutal beating by Robbie Lawler. Now, Matt Serra had his, he had his moment against GSP where he managed to beat definitely the greatest welterweight of all time. But prime Robbie Lawler, when he was a champion, he knocks out Matt Serra. He gets him out there early. This guy was a fucking savage. He was a marauder. People forget, man. Yeah, Robbie Lawler, he'd knock out Matt Serra in this fight. Then we've got Joaquin Buckley versus Jake Shields. Again, just an example of the modern welterweights taking over. Joaquin Buckley beats Jake Shields. Jake Shields might not have been the most entertaining fighter back in the day. Had some pretty good Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and wrestling, but I'm picking Joaquin Buckley to knock him out. Again, it's going to be a pretty common theme in this video where you see a guy from today's generation against a guy from at least 2 to 3 generations before. I'm always going to pick the guy from today's generation. Buckley keeps the fight standing and probably knocks out Jake Shields at some point within the fight, probably within the first 2 rounds. Buckley by KO. Sean Brady versus Vicente Luque. Now, this is a fight between 2 guys from a similar era. I'd say Vicente Luque can still kind of be considered in the modern era, even though he was more in his prime around when Usman was a champion. But this fight has been booked before. I think it was booked last year as well. But I'm going to go with Sean Brady to win this one. Even though Vicente Luque is a tough fight, you know, tough on the feet, got submission ability, Vicente Luque is just too inconsistent for my liking. Sean Brady has one loss to the former champion Belal Muhammad, and his wrestling, I'd say he's probably up there with arguably the best wrestling in this division right now. I could see Sean Brady out-grappling Vicente Luque just like Belal Muhammad did to Luque, and getting a decision win or some sort of TKO win within the fight. But I'm going to go with Sean Brady. I think his skill set is better, and Vicente Luque is just a bit too inconsistent for my liking. And then we've got Damian Maia versus Dan Hardy. Dan Hardy was alright back in his day, but he kind of had a bit of a fall off after that fight with GSP. I'm going to go with Damian Maia by submission. Damian Maia, he had quite a short prime. He didn't really have much longevity in the welterweight division, but he did have amazing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. So I think he either submits Dan Hardy. We've seen him get submitted before. If not, he keeps the fight on the ground and gets a decision win. Either way, Damian Maia, I think, would comfortably beat Dan Hardy if it's prime for prime. Shavkat Rakhmonov versus Rory McDonald. Rory McDonald, one of the greatest fighters of all time against Robbie Lawler, and Shavkat Rakhmonov, potentially a future champion, but Shavkat would finish Rory McDonald. I don't think Rory would give him an easy fight, though. I could see this going similar to the Jeff Neal fight, where Shavkat has to kind of overcome some adversity on the feet against Rory McDonald. But eventually, I do think Shavkat Rakhmonov would finish the fight. I mean, this dude's, what, 19-0, 18 finishes. The only guy to survive him so far is Ian Gary. I think he's finished 3 guys in the top 15 of the current welterweight division. So I don't see why I wouldn't pick him to finish Rory McDonald as well. I'm going to go with Shavkat to finish him, but I don't think it'd be an easy fight. Matt Brown versus Jeff Neal. Matt Brown has some good longevity as well in this division, but I think Jeff Neal knocks him out. I'm going to admit, this might be a bit of a hot take, especially with the current state of the welterweight division, but I think outside of maybe Jack Della Maddalena, Jeff Neal might be the most crisp boxer in this division. One of my dream fights at welterweight is Jeff Neal versus JDM, just because of the boxing display. Jeff Neal, great boxing, great movement for the division. I believe he would pick apart Matt Brown. I'm not sure if he'd get a finish over Matt Brown, but I do think he'd pick him apart and take him the distance and get a good decision win over Matt Brown. If it's a 5-rounder, probably gets a late finish. Jeff Neal probably gets a good win over Matt Brown just by piecing him up. Gilbert Burns versus Sean Shirk. Yeah, prime Gilbert Burns submits him in the first round. Sean Shirk, again, one of the older generation welterweights. Gilbert Burns in his prime. He had quite a short prime to Gilbert Burns. It lasted from like just before the Usman title fight, just until the Chimaev fight, I think. But he has really good Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, decent boxing. He takes down Sean Shirk and submits him in the first round. Ian Gary versus GSP. Now, Ian Gary would convince you that he destroys GSP. And I know there's going to be a few people in the comment section making a case to say that Ian Gary beats GSP because GSP beat nobody and Ian Gary's part of the modern era. Whatever recency bias you want to chuck in my way, I'm going to pick GSP. I really feel like GSP is one of these fighters that can adapt to any era of the welterweight division. He was so far ahead of his time. I'm picking GSP to beat him because I really do think he's better than Ian Gary everywhere the fight goes. Maybe from a technical kickboxing perspective, Ian Gary might be better than GSP, but as a mixed martial artist, I'm picking GSP. He's one of the few fighters that I can't really look at and say wouldn't, you know, be able to beat any of today's modern welterweights. GSP can adapt to any era. His skill set was that good. The fact that he could adapt to any opponent you put in front of him, I believe he would find a way to beat Ian Gary. I'm picking GSP to beat Ian Gary, probably by decision though. I don't think he stops Ian Gary. It could be quite a competitive fight, but GSP does win a decision. Carlos Condit versus Pat Miletich, the first ever welterweight champion. Carlos Condit gets this one done. Another fighter with kind of good longevity in the UFC, which I can't say about Pat Miletich because I think he's in prison now, but yeah, Carlos Condit, he had some good longevity. Another very well-rounded dude in the UFC. I think he finishes Pat Miletich in the first 2 just because of the difference in, well, just the improvement in skill across MMA and the longevity that MMA's had. Kamaru Usman versus Dong Hyun Kim. Dong Hyun Kim had a nice little run a couple of years ago back in the Tyron Woodley era, managed to make it into the top 10, and he had actually quite a good career. You look at his only losses. He only lost to some decent fighters, did Kim, but I am going to go with Kamaru Usman in his prime. Kamaru Usman in his prime, some people were saying that he could beat GSP. I'd say he's probably the second greatest welterweight of all time. Usman genuinely looked unstoppable in his prime. I think he gets either a late KO or a stoppage win over Hyun King. Probably more of a stoppage win over him. If we're talking prime Usman, the Usman that fought Masvidal the second time, the Usman that fought Burns, yeah, he's definitely getting some sort of stoppage over Kim. So I'm going to go with Kamaru Usman, and then we've got round 2 between the next set of welterweights. Jack Della Maddalena versus Michael Morales, a fight that could happen to modern welterweights. Morales has just beat Gilbert Burns. 1 or 2 more wins, he's probably going to get in a title fight, so this could happen. But I'm going to have to go with Jack to win this one, just because I've seen a lot more from Jack. This would be a very competitive stand-up fight, but I think Jack's definitely got the edge when it comes to the grappling, even though you don't really see him shooting takedowns. His grappling get-ups are good, but I don't think that'll be a factor in this fight. But he is probably the most crisp boxer in this division. Massively impressed me against Belal Muhammad, can kind of adapt to any opponent. Dangerous KO ability, just like Michael Morales does. And he's displayed it against much more opponents. He displayed it against Bilal. He displayed it against Gilbert Burns. Even though Michael Morales arguably performed better against Gilbert Burns than JDM, I'm going to go with JDM. I've seen more from him. He's been able to shoot at a higher level. And Michael Morales' best win is Gilbert Burns, who was on a 3-fight losing streak. So I'm going to go with JDM to beat Michael Morales, even though, again, could be a competitive fight nowadays. I probably could go either way. Leon Edwards versus BJ Penn. BJ Penn, I'm going to say this is a more well-rounded mixed martial artist than Leon Edwards. And prime for prime, definitely a better fighter, but I'm not going to sugarcoat this shit. Leon Edwards pieces him up. Yeah, the skill differential between the two of them is insane. The reason BJ Penn looked so good in his prime is because everybody else wasn't at his level. Leon Edwards is a much more technical fighter than BJ Penn, and I think he'd definitely pick apart BJ Penn. He keeps the fight standing, he doesn't get taken down, and he just picks apart BJ Penn across. The thing is, even though Leon's a decision machine, I could definitely see him stopping BJ Penn even in his prime, so I'm probably going to go with Leon Edwards by some sort of late TKO, if not by decision. But yeah, Leon Edwards, far too technical for BJ Penn. It gets to a point where the fighters in the modern era have just improved far past the fighters from BJ Penn's era. I'm picking Leon Edwards to win this one by most likely decision. Rafael dos Anjos versus Nick Diaz. Dog, I'm going with Nick Diaz to win this one too. I think this is a really bad stylistic matchup for Rafael dos Anjos. We saw him when he faced Tony Ferguson, and he was a bit of a victim on the feet. I think prime Nick Diaz in his absolute prime would probably have a good job at picking apart Rafael dos Anjos. I don't see there being too much of a grappling threat from Rafael dos Anjos against a guy like Nick Diaz, and I think on the feet, I'm going to favour Nick Diaz. Really good boxer. So I think Nick Diaz picks apart Rafael dos Anjos, maybe gets a late finish if it's a 5-rounder, but then again, we saw the fight with Tony Ferguson and Rafael dos Anjos, and dos Anjos is pretty fucking tough, so I'm probably going to go with decision win for Nick Diaz across 25 minutes against Rafael dos Anjos. Dos Anjos does better in the later rounds. Nick Diaz picks him apart for the first 3. I'm picking prime Nick Diaz to pick apart and beat Rafael dos Anjos. And then we've got Carlos Prates versus Colby Covington. Prime for prime, I'm picking Prates. There's no evidence to display that Carlos Prates is has bad defensive grappling. He's been able to defend takedowns in every single one of his fights in the UFC so far. In against Ian Gary, who people said was going to beat him with the wrestling, he was able to defend takedowns against him. So I really do think that Carlos Prates is one of the better anti-grapplers right now. And I know he hasn't really faced a grappler like Colby Covington as of yet. I mean, he's only he's only winning the top 15 is Neil Magny, but even in his prime, Colby Covington wasn't really a dangerous wrestler, just a very pressure and physical wrestler. And we know that Prates has good dribbility and a good gas tank. And on the feet, I think Carlos Prates is far too dangerous to Colby Covington. Probably gets a late TKO. I'm picking Carlos Prates to finish Colby Covington later on in the fight, even if it's prime for prime. Johnny Hendricks versus Nate Diaz. This would be one of those fights where Nick Diaz gets the shit beaten out of him, but he still looks good. Like, this would be the type of fight where Johnny Hendricks just completely picks apart and beats the crap out of Nate Diaz. But you can just picture it in the 5th round. Nate Diaz is walking forward with a face full of blood, calling it on, bringing on the action to Johnny Hendricks. But I'm going to pick Johnny Hendricks to win this one. In his prime, like I said before, far too dangerous as a fighter. Looked very good in his prime because of the roids. And Nate Diaz, most of his highlights are from when he's been a victim, to be honest, when he's got the blood streaming down his face and he's the guy getting pieced up. So I'm going to go with Johnny Hendricks to beat Nate Diaz, but I think Nate Diaz would show his durability, and it'd be one of those fights where Nate Diaz is in the 5th round that he's bringing it on. Johnny Hendricks still walking forward, but I'm going to go with Hendricks to win this one by decision. Bilal Muhammad versus Stephen Wonderboy Thompson. Well, I mean, we've seen this fight before. Bilal Muhammad out-wrestled him, so I have no reason to pick otherwise. Yeah, Bilal Muhammad just dominates him across 25 minutes with the wrestling. Not really much breakdown needed. We've seen the fight before. Bilal Muhammad won comfortably. Bilal Muhammad beat Stephen Wonderboy Thompson. Robbie Lawler versus Joaquin Buckley. Listen, the thing is, Robbie Lawler in his prime was a bad motherfucker, and Joaquin Buckley, I don't know, man. I'm not a massive fan of picking these guys who have only just broken into the top 10 to beat legends, but I am going to go with Joaquin Buckley. I think he's stylistically a bad matchup for a lot of people. Think about it. This guy's an extremely strong, powerful dude for the welterweight division. Great striking, great wrestling ability, very well-rounded dude. I think a modern Joaquin Buckley, I'm going to pick him to beat Robbie Lawler. I know it would be a very close fight, and he probably goes to a decision, if not a late finish, but he knocked out Stephen Wonderboy Thompson. He pieced up and finished Colby Covington. He destroyed and finished Vicente Luque. He out-wrestled and dominated Ruzi Boyev, who we recently saw win. I know Robbie Lawler is definitely the better fighter when it comes to merit, but in terms of skill, I've got to go with Joaquin Buckley. I think he's the much more developed fighter, and we're talking about a guy in the modern era too, so I'm picking Joaquin Buckley to beat Robbie Lawler, probably by a late finish or a decision. Sean Brady versus Damian Maia. This would go very similar to Sean Brady versus Michael Chiesa. I'm picking Sean Brady to beat Damian Maia. Yeah, Damian Maia might have had good Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, but I do trust that Sean Brady would have been able to avoid that and simply just out-wrestle Damian Maia across 25 minutes. And even if not, I think he has enough to keep the fight standing. We saw in that fight with Gilbert Burns, another good Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu artist, where Sean Brady kind of decided to keep the fight standing for a lot of it, and he had success. So I think whether he keeps the fight standing or whether he wants a grappling-heavy approach, I think Sean Brady would have a good chance at implementing both of them. So I'm going to pick Sean Brady to beat Damian Maia by decision. Shavkat Rakhmonov versus Jeff Neal, another fight that we've seen before. I'm picking Shavkat to beat Jeff Neal. Again, goes without saying, we saw this fight 2 years ago. Shavkat won the fight. Not comfortably, you know, Jeff Neal posed some problems on the feet, but eventually Shavkat Rakhmonov won the fight, and obviously I'm going to pick him to win the fight again. GSP versus Gilbert Burns. Gilbert Burns in his prime looked pretty fucking good, but couldn't really beat anybody elite. His best win is Neil Magny and Jorge Masvidal, and he got finished by Usman. So I'm going to go with GSP to finish Gilbert Burns. I know GSP wasn't really a finishing type of guy, but we've seen every single time Gilbert Burns faces an elite competition, like title contention competition, he falls short. And I'm not going to pick him to beat the greatest fucking welterweight of all time, GSP by finish. Usman versus Carlos Condit. Again, this would just be an example of the division moving. I think Usman dominates Carlos Condit. Whether he wants to take him down and maul him with the wrestling across 25 minutes, I think Usman can do that. Whether he wants to keep the fight standing and land that 1-2 down the pipe and maybe potentially finish Carlos Condit, I think he can do that too. Prime Usman, one of the baddest men on the planet. He finishes Carlos Condit. Round 3. Jack Della Maddalena versus Leon Edwards was supposed to happen early this year in March, and I am going to now lean towards Jack Della winning this fight. After Leon Edwards has just been dominated in his last two and Jack Della Maddalena has looked amazing in the last two, I know they're completely different styles, but I'm going to go with Jack to beat Leon. We know Leon can't really deal with pressure. Jack's going to put the pressure on Leon. He's going to back him up against the cage and beat him with the rips to the body, and I think a style that's made for beating Leon isn't just a striker, but a striker who's going to try and make it rough with him, and that's exactly what Jack's going to do. This is why I think that Ian Gary is stylistically quite a favourable matchup for Leon Edwards. Somebody who's going to keep it at range and have a technical fight with Leon. That's an ideal fighter for Leon, but a guy that's going to make it rough, a guy that's going to get in a dogfight, a guy that has much more heart than Leon is going to beat him, and that is Jack. So I'm going to pick Jack to pick apart Leon Edwards and probably pick up a decision win. Carlos Prates versus Nick Diaz. Listen, Carlos Prates probably beats Nick Diaz. He probably does. And I know a lot of the logic that I've used in this video doesn't really add up, because I am going to go with Nick Diaz to win. This is just because I've seen infinitely more from Nick Diaz, and I still think prime Nick Diaz had so much more to offer. You know, this guy went 5 rounds with GSP, 5 rounds with Anderson Silva. Some of the best boxing we've seen in the welterweight division. His toughness, his chin, his durability as well. I think Nick Diaz was such a physical, well, maybe not his stamina, because he kind of gassed out after the 3rd round in nearly every fight, but I really do feel like, and this is a big if Nick Diaz could avoid getting knocked out by Carlos Prates, I could see him having the better output over Carlos Prates and winning the decision. I know it would be a very, very close fight. It's a hard sell. But think about it. A 25-minute fight. Nick Diaz might have the gas out in the last 2 rounds. He's known for having a good chin. He's known for having good durability. If he just kind of outlands Carlos Prates for the first 3, which he could do because he's a good volume striker as Nick Diaz and Carlos Prates isn't, I could see Nick Diaz just about scraping a decision win. I'm going to pick Nick Diaz to beat Carlos Prates. Recency bias, you can get out the window. Johnny Hendricks versus Bilal Muhammad. Now, I'm not just going to pick, you know, I'm not picking Johnny Hendricks because of the recent performance that Bilal had against JDM, but I am going to go with Johnny Hendricks to beat Bilal Muhammad. Prime Johnny Hendricks. Like I said before, this guy will beat GSP, and I think he's a really bad matchup for Bilal. We just saw Bilal get roughed up by Jack when he got put in a real dogfight. Johnny Hendricks is going to force Bilal Muhammad into a dogfight. I think the KO threat on the feet from Johnny Hendricks is way too big for Bilal Muhammad. Not that Bilal Muhammad's got a bad chin, he's got a great chin, but I can see him getting tagged a lot. And after Bilal Muhammad's recent performance against Jack Della Maddalena, it doesn't really give me hope against him against a guy like Johnny Hendricks. Maybe he'd land a couple of takedowns against Hendricks, but Hendricks wasn't a bad wrestler in his prime either, so I'm going to go with Johnny Hendricks to pick up a decision win over Bilal Muhammad. Likely roughs him up a little bit, but I still think it'd be quite a competitive fight. And then we've got Sean Brady versus Joaquin Buckley, a fight between 2 modern welterweights that could definitely go down. And right now, I am going to go with Sean Brady to beat Joaquin Buckley. I think Sean Brady is one of the best welterweights in the world. We just saw how he dominated Leon Edwards better than Bilal Muhammad and got the finish to put the cherry on top. Arguably the best grappler in the division right now. Maybe his hands aren't on the same level as Joaquin Buckley, but I do think the pace that Sean Brady puts on people, the wrestling of Sean Brady would be a bit of a tough, tough thing for Joaquin Buckley to overcome, but it would be an amazing fight. Fairly 50-50. I'm leaning towards Sean Brady though. Shavkat Rakhmonov versus GSP. If you're getting your back taken by Ian Gary and you're going 25 minutes, and I'm not going to just completely shit on Shavkat for this, but he made Ian Gary, I don't know, he did look kind of beatable in that fight with Ian Gary. I'm going to go with GSP, but we are now have an uneven amount of welterweight, so I've had to bring Usman into the conversation as well, because I've completely miscalculated this, and now we've got to bring in somebody else. So I'm bringing back Usman, Prime Usman. I'm going to stick him in this too. Prime Usman versus Prime GSP versus Prime Shavkat in a triple threat match. I'm going GSP to win this one. I was still picking GSP to beat Usman when Usman was in his prime as a champion and everyone was so high on Usman. Like I said before, GSP can adapt to any fighter. I really do feel like he'd be able to adapt to Shavkat and win a decision in that fight. Him and Usman is a fight of dreams. It's one of the greatest fights you can see. But I'm going to pick Usman. I'm going to pick GSP to beat Usman. I'm going to pick him to beat Shavkat. And because of that, he's going straight to the final. See you then. Round 4. Jack Della Maddalena versus Nick Diaz. These guys look kind of... I know in these photos it doesn't really show, but just in general, I feel like these guys kind of look similar. Jack Della Maddalena looks like the long-lost Diaz brother. But I'm going to pick Jack to beat Nick Diaz. I mean, we're talking about a modern-day boxer versus an older generation boxer. Jack Della Maddalena... Jack is better everywhere the fight goes. He has got better boxing than Nick Diaz. He's probably more durable and has better stamina than Nick Diaz. He's definitely better anti-grappler than Nick Diaz. I think Jack just wins this one. It would be an absolute fucking war. It'd be a dogfight on the feet. But I'm going to go with Jack. His boxing is better than Nick Diaz. He picks him apart across 25 minutes. Isn't an easy fight. Nick Diaz is a fucking tough brawler, but I'm picking Jack to get this one done by decision. Hendricks versus Brady. I'm going to go with Brady to win this one. It gets to the point where, you know, the modern kind of fighters take over, and I think the grappling of Sean Brady would be too much. I think the difference between a guy like Sean Brady and Bilal Muhammad, and we kind of saw this in the Leon fighters, I feel like Sean Brady's going to work a guy like Johnny Hendricks a lot more, and I also think he's got a lot more to offer on the feet, so I am going to pick Sean Brady to beat Johnny Hendricks. Very, very tough fight to pick. And again, if you're getting finished on the feet by Bilal Muhammad, you could definitely get finished by Johnny Hendricks. But I'm going to pick Sean Brady to nullify Johnny Hendricks. And listen, the fight IQ of Bilal Muhammad, the fight IQ in that fight with Jack Del Mala barely shooting takedowns is not a smart idea. Sean Brady ain't going to do that. Sean Brady's not going to keep the fight standing and give you a chance. He's going to shoot takedowns immediately and make it a tough fight. So I'm going to go with Sean Brady to beat Johnny Hendricks, and I'm picking him to win this one. I'm going to say by decision. The semi-final, JDM versus Sean Brady. I mean, this fight could happen. Sean Brady's like one good win away from a title fight against JDM, and I am, as of right now, going to pick JDM, and that's because of the Bilal Muhammad fight. We saw JDM, one of the best anti-grapplers in the UFC. His scrambles, his ability to get back up at standing after getting taken down is amazing. Just survived Bilal Muhammad and picked him apart, and I think it'd be very similar to Sean Brady. Now, like I said, there is a bigger submission threat from Sean Brady, and I think Sean Brady would definitely shoot a lot more takedowns on JDM than a guy like Bilal Muhammad. So I actually think stylistically he's a worse fight for JDM than Bilal. But I just think JDM will be able to keep the fight standing. We've seen it against Bilal. I don't see why he wouldn't be able to do it again. His submission, anti-submission ability is good as well. And on the feet, it's not even the same ball game. So I'm going to go with JDM to beat Sean Brady in a very similar fashion to how he beat Bilal. And then the final, JDM versus GSP. Call it nostalgia bias. I'm going to go with GSP. Simply because he can adjust to any fighter. I know when it comes to modern fighters, the consensus basis is that the modern fighters have evolved so much more than fighters around the GSP era. But GSP was a one-in-a-kind fighter. He could adapt to any style you put in front of him. The guy came back 4 years later, beat Bisping. He was just so smart with his fight IQ. As a fighter, he was so well-rounded. I believe across 25 minutes, he will be able to solve the issue in Jack Della Maddalena and get the win. He's able to solve any fighter. His ability to kind of adjust to anyone he's facing is on a different level. So I'm going to pick GSP to beat JDM. I haven't really got much actual in-octagon breakdowns because I don't really see how this fight would go down. I don't know if, you know, GSP would have a grappling-heavy approach, if he'd try and nullify him with a strike, and I'm not sure what he'd do. I do think JDM is the better striker out of the two of them, but I believe across 25 minutes, GSP would find a way to win because we're talking about the greatest welterweight of all time, GSP, and arguably the greatest fight IQ, and arguably the greatest of all time, full stop. Anyway, that's me creating an all-time welterweight tournament between every welterweight. The final was Jack Della Maddalena and GSP, which was kind of expected. Let me know your thoughts on this tournament, if you agree or disagree, if you change anything around. But yeah, just let me know your thoughts. Thank you for watching.